100 years ago this evening, election returns from across the country were signaling a huge sea change in Canadian politics. After 16 years in power, 4 back-to-back majority governments. I'm not sure that record has been bested in the years since. I can't think of anybody who has done so. So after 16 years in power, 4 back-to-back majorities. So Wilfrid-Laurier's pro-free trade liberals were heading to heavy defeat at the hands of Robert Borden's Tories. The election was marked by many debates familiar to us today: the role of the military in a middle power like Canada, the trade relationship with the United States, the role of the business community in politics, and the place of Quebec and Quebec nationals in Canada. And many others, but those are the ones that come to mind for me. To feed our reflections on this momentous event in Canadian history, both seen historically and for the influence and the resonances that it has today, we have a wonderful assemblage of speakers, and let me take a moment and introduce them to you. First of all, we have Patrice Dutil. Patrice, who is, of course, the author of the book. Can you just hand me the book just for a second? For those of you who might not have seen it, the centerpiece of this evening's discussion, Canada 1911, the decisive election that shaped the country. Patrice is Associate Professor and Undergraduate Director in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson, and Canada 1911 is his 5th book. I have to mention that he founded and edited for 5 years the monthly Literary Review of Canada, because that fine publication published several works of an obscure author named Brian Crowley. And I am forever grateful. Patrice's co-author, David Mackenzie, could not be with us tonight, but I think it's important that we acknowledge him even in his absence. He's also Associate Professor in the Department of History at Ryerson, and Canada 1911 is his 8th book. I'm going to introduce all 3 people, and then I won't have to interrupt the flow of the discussion. So after Patrice has introduced the book and talked a little about the main themes, Derek Burney will speak next. Derek is Senior Strategic Advisor at what is now called Norton Rose, and he is known to everyone in Ottawa, Senior Research Fellow at CDFAI, the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute, visiting professor and Senior Distinguished Fellow at Carleton. He's a well-known business leader in Canada, having been President and Chief Executive of CAE and Chairman and Chief Executive of Bell Canada International, and of course he served as both Canada's ambassador to the United States and Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and many other accomplishments, but I think people want to hear what you have to say rather than us spending a lot of time reading everybody's bio. Jack Granatstein. Jack is a distinguished historian of Canada. He's written numerous books and articles on political history, foreign policy, military history, and defense. You hear Jack frequently comment on those topics in the media. He spent many years at York University, finally escaping in 1995 from what I'm sure was a very unpleasant period. And amongst many other things, he is the former director and CEO of the Canadian War Museum. In fact, I think the first director and CEO of the War Museum. So that is our panel for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will proceed as follows. Patrice will get 10 minutes reviewing for us the highlights of the book and on the election 1911. Then I'll ask Derek to speak for 5 minutes on themes he thinks are particularly relevant to Canada today, rising from the discussion about the election 1911, including obviously the issue of free trade and Canada-U.S. relations, but Derek's brief is as wide-ranging as he would like it to be. Ditto for Jack. Jack's first interest, of course, is in the influence of the 1911 election on military policy, but we all know the breadth of Jack's interests, and we hope they'll be on display this evening. When each of the speakers has concluded, we will open the floor for questions for about 10 minutes or until everybody is exhausted. And So let me turn things over to Patrice.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm honored by your presence, and I speak on behalf of David Mackenzie, my co-author and colleague from Ryerson University, who's teaching this afternoon and couldn't make it to Ottawa. He sends his gratitude and his greetings through me. Merci d'être venu ce soir. J'apprécie beaucoup votre présence, histoire de se rappeler un peu les grands événements d'il y a 100 ans. C'est une grande élection pour le Canada et je suis heureux que vous soyez ici avec nous pour souligner l'événement. This is a very special afternoon for us, David and I. This project started 3 years ago when over a sandwich, David and I were lamenting the state of political history. We do that a lot. A lot of this book is really an extension of my notes in Jack Granstein's class on 20th century Canada that I took 30 years ago. So if you have any problems with some of my conclusions, let me just say that they really were Jack's. I'm delighted and flattered that he's here tonight to share this moment. He's always been my model academic, and his presence here makes the event doubly special. I want to thank Mr. Burney for his kindness in making this event possible in so many ways. He bears witness to the closing of one of the great issues of the 1911 election, and his presence here tonight makes it all the more historically important. At this moment, 100 years ago, Untitled-Laurier, the Prime Minister of Canada, was in his suite in the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. He's getting ready to eat a few sandwiches. He was alone for a good part of the early evening. His wife, Zoe, was here in Ottawa. He had spent the day in Quebec City, touring a few ridings, and had lunch in the home of a local organizer. He was taken to the hotel at mid-afternoon, and his room was rigged with private wire so that he could read the telegrams coming from all parts of Canada. For him, these were saddening telegrams. By the time Toronto had voted, he knew his days as Prime Minister were over after almost 16 years. Plusieurs reporters ont demandé à Untitled-Laurier, à ses accompagnateurs, quelle est la réaction du chef? Dans quel état d'esprit est-il? La réponse était simple, elle était directe, le chef a pris ça comme un chef. Robert Borden was in Halifax. His mood was altogether quite different. The years in opposition, especially since 1909, had been very difficult for him. On this evening, 100 years ago, he was vindicated, and the election of 1911 took on an altogether different meaning. This was a new beginning for the Conservative Party, and probably the last time Borden would be truly happy. History tells us that only difficult days lie ahead. The story of the 1911 election is full of drama, and David and I really were struck by how much there is involved in this. Treason, broken promises. It's Canadian politics at its best. The boldness of Laurier, who after so many years in power decided that Canada was ready to take on the big challenges of adapting to reciprocity, something of a free trade agreement with the United States. He knew the nationalist movement in Quebec was against him on the issue of the Canadian Navy, but he forged ahead anyway. He made mistakes, and though David and I, like most historians, admire Laurier very much, the old man made many errors. His party wasn't ready, and he misread the public mood. But he was magnificent, and tonight he should be remembered for his boldness and his daring. Robert Borden ran a triumphant campaign, subjected to waves of doubt about his abilities as a leader for a long time, but especially from 1909 and 1911. He was girded for battle, thoroughly prepared. He worked on his speeches, hammered the Conservative machine into a disciplined vote-getting apparatus. He got a deal with the Nationalists. He worked Ontario and BC mercilessly, struck the right chords, and emerged victorious. His victory was both personal and political. Human drama mattered, but the issues were greater. 1911 remains to this day the mother of all elections, because Canadians discussed great existentialist questions. Would reciprocity spell the end of Canada? Would Laurier's Navy spell the end of Canada's autonomy? The battle raged across the land for almost 2 months. That August and September, and on this night 100 years ago, Canadian men chose. I say Canadian men because women did not vote. It was the last time women did not vote. And the voters were divided. Over 72% of eligible voters turned out, and they split their votes. David and I calculated the nationalist vote in Quebec, something no one had done before. And in Quebec, Henri Bourassa's nationalist movement garnered 26.7% of the vote. On a national basis, the Liberals took 47.7% of the vote, while the Conservatives earned 44.6%. That's less than the Liberals. The nationalist vote contributed 6% on the national scale. This was a tight race. 71 of the 221 seats, that's almost a third, were won by less than 5%, a 5% plurality. 29 of those ridings were actually won by less than 3% pluralities. Had Laurier taken 24 of those close races, he would have stayed in power, and history would probably have been much different. So we looked at what changed, and we focused especially on who switched votes. The results are described in the book, and some were surprising. In many cases, it was individual polls that made the difference. We're not sure why, but clearly there was something in the microclimate of many ridings that changed the attitude of the voters. Some people were afraid of integration with the United States. Some were afraid of involvement in British wars. And you'll read in the book, the politicians of 1911 on both sides knew full well that war with the Kaiser was imminent. It was going to happen, and it was a question of how much Canada was going to contribute. It's actually quite striking to read that. In some cases, Liberals took seats from the Tories, but that was rare. The Liberals were wiped out in British Columbia, they lost massively in Ontario and Quebec, and they lost battles in the trench warfare of maritime politics. It's a great thing that so many people have gathered in the capital tonight to remember this epic event of 100 years ago. It reminds us of our debt to leaders who did their best to guide our nation along a better path. But it's also an occasion to consider the forks in our national destiny and how we can learn from the past. We did learn, but I'll leave it to Mr. Burney and Professor Granston to take the story from here. I want to repeat my thanks to Brian Lee Crowley, to Kim Chadsey, the whole crew at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for hosting this reception, for making this evening special. And I can't, of course, end without acknowledging with deep gratitude Dundurn Press for publishing this book, for believing in the project. Believe me, approaching publishers in modern Canada with the idea that the election of 1911 was a turning point, was the great election, tends to gather hesitation, let's say.
Uncomprehending stares.
Uncomprehending stares, silence on the phone. Dundurn believed in the project from the beginning. David and I are both very grateful to them for their support. Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you for helping us remember this great event.
Thank you very much, Patrice, and thank you, Brian, and congratulations to you for the outstanding work of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to welcome innovation in Ottawa. I want to congratulate Patrice and his co-author on what I'm sure is an excellent analysis of one of our most riveting elections, a unique contribution to Canadian psephology, certainly one that we in government in the 1980s were reminded of time and again, especially as we took up the free trade challenge in 1986. So I'm going to start my remarks with a few comments about the comparisons between the two elections and then address the more general theme by way of conclusion. Now, I have to say at the outset that unlike Jack, I did not participate in the 1911 election. But I did have an inside view of the run-up to to 1988. And one particularly vivid reminder came via Flora Macdonald, who actually brought into the cabinet, Patrice, comic books from the 1911 election, just to remind us of how difficult the challenge would be. Needless to say, her comic book reinforced concerns and opposition to the free trade agreement of more than a few in cabinet. But decision-making in those days was often a bit what I characterize as Lincoln-esque. And the fact that the Prime Minister was in favor of the negotiations overrode the negatives of his many cabinet colleagues. Now, the economic rationale was probably somewhat similar to that in 1911. Economic arguments for free trade or trade liberalization are compelling. They usually are, at least, to academics. But the problems in 1911 and again in 1988 were political. And there were significant political differences between the two elections, as far as I know. First of all, allegiance to the British Empire was a major factor in 1911. It was of no relevance in 1988. Some of you may recall that Prime Minister Diefenbaker pledged in the 1950s to divert 15% of Canada's trade away from the United States to the United Kingdom. It was a bit like King Canute trying to hold back the tides. And later on, the third option from a different Prime Minister suffered a very similar fate. But in 1986 to 1988, the major change in political attitude was in Quebec. Ontario business was much less negative in the 1980s than they had been in 1911, even though Premier Peterson had reservations, which he was not able to explain. I can only tell you that at one FedProv meeting, I went up to him and I said, "Now, Premier, you're my Premier. You're the Premier of Ontario. What problem do you have with this agreement that's being negotiated?" He said, "Well, I can't really explain it. It just doesn't make me feel good in my tummy." So not being a doctor, I wasn't able to respond to his problem. But when you think about it, Ontario was the principal benefactor of the Auto Pact, which in many ways inspired the free trade agreement. But Quebec, as I said, under Premier Bourassa, was staunchly pro-free trade, and this made a huge difference, especially as the Mulroney government drew most of its strength from the West and Quebec. The maritime provinces, again from my limited study of history before I've read the book, Patrice, had been generally supportive of reciprocity in 1911, but were much less so in the 1980s. Notably, Prince Edward Island's Joe Giz, father of the current premier. He was one of the two premiers who were firmly on the opposition side. The other was Howard Pauley of Manitoba. 7 of the premiers were very much in favor. Peterson, as I've indicated, stayed in the middle throughout the negotiation. The most profound political change, of course, was in the attitude of the major parties. The Conservatives had been opposed in 1911, but under Mulroney, they became firm advocates. Free trade was a major pillar in their determination to improve relations with the United States. Now, the Liberals are traditional champions of free trade and certainly liberalized trade more generally. They switched to oppose. Some would suggest more for anti-American reasons than anti-free trade reasons, but you could draw your own conclusions on that one. A major driver for us in these negotiations was our conviction that in order to compete successfully on a global basis, we had to be competitive first right here in North America. And I think that same principle applies even today. As for the negotiation, well, as James Baker said in his memoirs, it really was an ear-run thing. And I think those of you who were around in 1987 will remember that. The deal we wanted from the Americans with a binational mechanism for dispute settlement was elusive up until the very end. We needed this in order to counter the threat of capricious, arbitrary decisions by U.S. trade tribunals, which was a major driver for the negotiations themselves. And Canada's vulnerability to U.S. protectionism is never ending. You see examples of it right now with the latest Buy America impulse. This is something that requires constant vigilance by Canadians. It was only precisely at the 11th hour, almost, 14 years ago, early next month, that Baker managed to convince some key congressional leaders and his lawyers that he needed a dispute settlement mechanism in order to conclude an agreement. And that's what broke the logjam. But even then, it wasn't really over, but I won't bore you unless you want more detail in the question period. The 1988 election was certainly unlike any other I have witnessed. I can't compare it directly, as I said, to 1911, but it was certainly unusual in terms of all the ones I've seen. It was essentially a single-issue campaign. And it's the only time, I believe, and I stand to be corrected by historians or others present, the government actually started ahead in the polls, fell back sharply after the debate, only to rise again and finish more or less where they had started in the polls. It was a raucous affair. We had our own comic books featuring the 10 big lies about free trade. But when Michael Wilson announced in Ottawa that John Turner was a liar, the Peace Tower clock stopped. This was unheard of language. And at one point in the campaign, something I remember vividly, Turner said that if they won, I was going to Pyongyang, not Washington. Nonetheless, after campaigning vigorously against the FTA in 1988 and the NAFTA in 1993, the Liberals, as you know, quickly became happy converts. So if nothing else, it proves the elasticity or the flexibility of Canadian politics. Now, the Tories won 169 of the then 295 seats in 1988. Compare that with today. Down from their 1984 sweep, but they still won the most seats in Quebec by a landslide, Ontario, Alberta, and Manitoba, and they tied for first in New Brunswick. They were shut out only in PEI. Now, I actually think the economic dividends turned out even better than our expectations, which were based, of course, more on theory than anything else. Certainly all the fears regarding health care, pensions, our vaunted social programs were supposed to go down the drain because of the free trade agreement. Well, they proved illusory. Even industries that were expected to disappear entirely, the Ontario wine industry was going to be paved over, we were told. Quebec garment manufacturing, same thing. Well, what has happened? They've both flourished since free trade. Now, the U.S. did not always adhere to the rules or even to the decisions of the dispute settlement mechanism, but they are Americans, after all. But the dispute settlement mechanism helped ameliorate many disputes in our favor and served, I believe, as a safety valve, having a therapeutic effect more generally. The FTA, as you probably know, gave rise to NAFTA, more a matter of defense than offense for Canada. But it also helped prompt the conclusion of the Uruguay round of multilateral negotiations. And that was a strategic objective for the Americans in getting involved in FTA. They thought that was the way the rest of the world would wake up to the reality that they could do things differently if the world didn't want to come around. The creation of the WTO with many similar features from the free trade agreement, including the dispute settlement provisions. You know, the fact that there has been no multilateral trade negotiation since that has succeeded, I think speaks for itself. In the first decade, the trade volumes soared well above expectations. They tripled, in fact. Trade with the U.S. has languished in the most recent decade, in part because of 9/11 and the consequent border shenanigans in the name of security, but more so because of a weakening U.S. economy. As I look out, the traditional form of trade negotiations are no longer sufficient to deal with the kind of problems we face with the Americans today. And that's why, and that's where, the regulatory and the perimeter security negotiations fit in. While the hobgoblins about sovereignty persist and always will, they're not getting, at least not yet, the kind of traction that almost derailed the free trade agreement 24 years ago. We will hear some echoes about sovereignty if and when the perimeter regulatory talks produce a result, but it's unlikely, in my view, to be as dramatic politically as either 1911 or 1988. What seems evident to me is that both our politics and our economic performance, even our sense of self, are more mature, more confident as a result of the FTA and NAFTA. Now, I'm sure that comment alone may spark some debate, and that's why I've said it. I've always believed, though, that better rules of engagement were vital for Canada in managing relations with the United States. They actually represent to me assertions of sovereignty that serve our national interests in a tangible manner. They're more important to us precisely because of the huge power imbalance. Thank you very much.
Fortunately, I kept my notes from my lectures that Pat heard, so I had everything I wanted to say ready. I really have only 3 points. I was told I had 5 minutes, and 3 points is 5 minutes. There were 2 big issues in the election of 1911, as Pat has said. In Quebec, it was different pretty much. In French Quebec, it was different pretty much than in English Canada. Quebec was more interested in the Navy question because it was and still is anti-imperialist. At that point, it was British imperialism that frightened Quebec. Today, it's probably American imperialism. It was, I think, more anti-imperialist than anti-military, although there was certainly a major streak of anti-militarism in Quebec then and now. It was primarily frightened by the idea that a Canadian Navy, I guess we could call it the Royal Canadian Navy again, would cooperate with the Royal Navy in a British war. And that, to many people in Quebec, and I think in 1911 this was absolutely illusory, that led to the idea that there would need to be conscription to man this Navy. The idea that we would have enough ships that could possibly require conscription to keep them crewed was simply inconceivable. And yet, by voting against Laurier in the percentages that they did in Quebec, and by electing Robert Borden, Quebec probably guaranteed that conscription would come in the war that Pat tells us people expected to follow. So, not for the first time, not for the last time, Quebec voted against its perceived self-interest. The other point I'd make on Quebec's attitudes is that they are, to my mind at least, strikingly similar today on military questions as they were 100 years ago. Not much has changed. Second point I want to make is about leadership. Borden won the 1911 election, won in 1917 again. But he is considered by historians who study questions of leadership and who rank prime ministers. And with Norman Hilmer, I've done a ranking of prime ministers. Borden invariably ranks down towards the upper middle, about 7 or 8. Laurier, on the other hand, is always a hot contender for number 1 with Macdonald, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, with Macdonald and Mackenzie King. Why isn't it the Macdonald-Laurier King Institute? Then you get all 3 of the best prime ministers. Mackenzie King ranks first in Hilmer's and my ranking. He ranked second in another ranking that Norman Hilmer did just this year. So Mackenzie King usually does very well in these things. Borden, to my mind, deserves to rank where he does. The 1911 election was a vicious anti-American campaign. It was appalling. The 1917 election was a vicious anti-French campaign. It was even worse. To Canadian historians who think that preserving unity is the primary goal of the Prime Minister, Borden inevitably slips down. Sure, he won the war, but unity's seen as more important by historians. I'm not sure that's a fair assessment, But nonetheless, that's the way Borden has been ranked down. And Laurier, who made mistakes, as Pat pointed out, nonetheless always ranks very high, in part because he was charming, in part because he hid his iron fist very carefully in his velvet glove. My third point is the most important one, to my mind. The key result of the 1911 election was that it marked the beginning of the breakup of the traditional two-party system. It hit at businessmen's support for Laurier. The Toronto 18 withdrew their support and gave it to the Tories. And it then hit at their workers' votes. It hit at Laurier's support in Quebec because of the Navy. It left the grids weakened in Quebec and in English Canada. The 1917 election, with conscription hitting at English Canadian Liberals, hitting at farmers, and the war and conscription hitting at French Canadians in the Conservative Party, left the way open for a major third party to emerge, the Progressives, the Farmers' Party that emerged in the 1921 election in a very major way. The two-party system was dead. And only now, 100 years later, is there a real chance of recreating it. If I was a liberal and I was a New Democrat, I'm not, happily, I would be leaping at the chance to form that single party that would have a real possibility of defeating the Tories. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three members of our panel this evening. I think all of those remarks were extremely apropos and insightful. Before I open the floor for questions, by the way, can I just say we're going to have a draw when we're done this evening, and the lucky person whose business card will be taken out of this bowl will get 2 free tickets for our History Wars, our first History Wars event, taking place on the 27th, later this month. David Frum and Lawrence Martin will be debating the legacy of Pierre Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada. So if you haven't already handed in your business card, I'm going to hand the bowl over to Kim, and if anybody wants to hand their card down the road to Kim to put in the bowl, we'll make sure that you participate in the draw. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions to Patrice, to Derek, and Jack. Over to you. While people are thinking about it, I have to say, Patrice, that I had not realized that the Tories had actually taken fewer votes than the Liberals in the election of 1911. And it put me in mind of those of you who remember these things long time ago. The Conservative Prime Minister, Premier of New Brunswick, Richard Hatfield, I think won 3 successive elections as Premier. The first 2, the Liberals won more votes than the Tories did in New Brunswick. And I well remember listening to the CBC broadcast about the second Hatfield election, in which some high-powered CBC journalist from Toronto had been sent to the CBC studio in Fredericton, and they were discussing the election results, and all of a sudden this guy from Toronto said, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Mr. Hatfield seems to be winning the election, but he's got fewer votes than the Liberals, to which the local CBC journalist said, oh, well, that's just the way we run elections. Yes?
What accounts for the fact that Quebec in 1988 and Mr. Barassa were so supportive of free trade at that point, with the fears of imperialism and so on that might have been behind their military?
Well, unlike a couple of reasons I can think of. Unlike 1911 or even perhaps today, there was not a sense of anti-Americanism in Quebec the way there was in English Canada, and particularly in Toronto. I felt myself that Quebecers felt a little more confident about their own position in North America. They didn't feel threatened by the mass media and the cultural invasion from the United States. But a second factor was the personality of Robert Bourassa, who was an economist. He was a strong believer. He had studied in the United States when he was in that in-between period. And a lot of his economic program was based on expanding the energy power production of Quebec, which was going to depend on exports to the United States. I think it's relevant to note for you that today, 1/3 of our exports to the United States are energy, which is a good thing in that it's the least fettered by all the stuff at the border. So, on top of that, you had a prime minister who was from Quebec, who had been a skeptic about free trade when he ran for leader, which is always a good position to be in when you're running for leader. He became converted by a number of things, not the least of which was the Macdonald-Royal Commission, which Pierre Trudeau had initiated. And in fact, Pierre Trudeau also initiated what were called sectoral negotiations with the United States. Those began back in 1982 as a result of a trade policy review that we had done. And the problem we discovered with the sectoral initiative was that it was very difficult to find a balance of interests in individual sectors, because one would favor one more than the other in terms of countries. And so when we tried to replicate the Auto Pact, we found that wasn't getting any traction, and it wasn't attracting much interest anywhere, either in Canada or the United States. And that led eventually to the full-blown free trade negotiations.
And Gary, one thing you didn't mention was, and I'm interested in whether you would agree, I think a number of observers at the time made the point that the nationalist movement was quite sympathetic to free trade because they wanted to see a counterweight to the economic argument in favor of Confederation.
No, I would agree with that totally. I think that it was not a divisive issue in Quebec for that reason, as well as the others that I've mentioned. And that's true to this day, where the sovereignist movement is always very careful to try to position itself comfortably vis-a-vis the United States in the least threatening way, as an omen of instability of any kind.
Yes, Matt.
Matt Dodd from the Institute for Liberal Studies. In the elections with which I'm familiar, after a premier or a prime minister has served 2 or 3 terms, there seems to be sort of a growing, trend of patience for the electorate for them to leave and be replaced. I'm curious whether that was also the case in 1911, and what the sort of breakdown was between Laurier's, personal popularity and the electorate's feelings on the policy issues, specifically the trade issue.
Well, thank you for your question. Polls did not exist in those days, so it's very difficult for us to be able to give you a precise answer on that. We can go by different gauges, though. Laurier, when you read the newspaper accounts, when you read the correspondence, was attracting enormous crowds. And it's staggering. In the last day of the election, September 20th, Laurier started a tour of Montreal. And if you put together the newspaper accounts, he would have been seen by 100,000 people that day. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. And I think Laurier was extremely popular, personally popular. Now there are divisions inside his party, and they're not small divisions. The Toronto 18 mostly were Liberals. They broke away from Laurier. Clifford Sifton, longtime Minister of the Interior, had broken away from Laurier, so to speak, in 1906. Still was a backbencher in the Liberal Party ranks, however, which is kind of strange, and campaigned openly and actively, shadowing Laurier across the country, across Eastern Canada, denouncing him for what he was doing with reciprocity. Laurier was also, of course, faced division inside the ranks in Quebec. The progressive wing had abandoned him in the Liberal Party in Quebec, and a big chunk of the nationalist movement was also formerly Liberal. So he wasn't very popular, certainly among certain Liberals. As I said, Robert Borden had difficult years in 1909 over the Naval Service Act. Many times he offered to resign. There were lots of rumors that Richard McBride, the Premier of British Columbia, would succeed him, should succeed him. Numerous times the caucus spoke out against him in wrenching scenes, behind closed doors, of course, where Robert Borden sort of tendered his resignation and was told, no, keep it in your vest pocket and we'll carry on. So both leaders, I suspect, both leaders had real trouble internally, but Laurier certainly remained highly popular, personally very popular, through the entire campaign and beyond. Even his adversaries said many great things about him personally. Mr. Borden, not quite so much. He was not as warm a personality as Laurier. It hadn't been in power, obviously, was well known as Laurier. Suffered a little bit as a result of that. Yeah?
Paul.
Yeah, sure. My name is Bob Samodo, and my question is for Mr. Birney. I had the distinction of being a candidate in the 1988 free trade election in this particular riding of Ottawa Centre. My question is about the state of preparedness of the Conservative campaign for what turned out to be, in effect, as you describe, a referendum on free trade. The party had started at around 42, 43% of the polls, and then at some point after the debate had plummeted. It was pretty evident to me, knocking on doors from day one, that it was going to be the decisive issue of the campaign. Yet it seemed that the Conservative Brain Trust was either unprepared or were hoping that it was going to go away to the point that senior campaign strategists in particular had proposed in the middle of the campaign that Brian Mulroney announced that he would defer the question of free trade and put it into a referendum. So were the Tories really unprepared for how that campaign ensued, and how ultimately did they get it back on track and claim victory?
I'm glad you got the story about the call for a referendum a little clearer tonight than in your book, Bob. That's an inside story that he didn't elaborate on, so neither will I.
Oh, both sides are in the book.
Yeah, well, maybe in the new book. I think a fair comment that the government was not prepared for that to become as visceral an issue as it became, for the simple reason that the debate had been going on since the fall of 1987. You may recall, the agreement was concluded in the fall of 1987, and the government's attempt to move the legislation through Parliament was stymied by the Senate, which refused to pass the agreement. But the debate had gone on for almost 10 months in Parliament. And I can tell you, this is very personal, but I can tell you that during the famous debate, which Turner was supposed to have won and Mulroney lost, that was not the impression any of us sitting and watching it in the studio got, for the simple reason that we didn't hear anything new from Turner. We were hearing exactly what we had heard all during the campaign, or all during the previous 10 months in Parliament. But the fact is, 15 million Canadians who watched it on TV were hearing it for the first time. And it was only at that time that the government realized that it had a problem with the sort of sleepy election campaign it had been running up until that point. And again, to be very personal, when I came home that night, one of my sons came to me and he said, Dad, he said, why doesn't the Prime Minister accept this agreement as his own? I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, in the debate he talked about 35 economists, 7 premiers, 45 newspaper editorials, all of this support the agreement, but he never said what his position was. So don't you think, he should start defending his own agreement? Well, I can tell you the first change we made the next day was the Prime Minister was given a copy of the agreement. He had it with him every minute of every day for the remainder of that campaign, and he defended it not as an agreement endorsed by a lot of third parties, which he always liked, but as his agreement. There was one paralyzing moment when he was in British Columbia. I can remember it vividly. And he was being heckled, as he was being heckled everywhere in the campaign. And he said, now look, if you guys will just calm down, let me give my speech. I will sit down with you after and you can ask me any question you want about what's in the free trade agreement, and I will answer it. Well, I said to Mark Doherty, the press secretary, this is going to be interesting. But sure enough, at the end of the debate, he sat down, the TV cameras were on him, and the three people that were sitting around the table, he said, okay, here's the agreement, ask me anything about what's in this agreement. First question, well, it's going to destroy our social programs. Okay, show me where in the agreement does it say it's going to destroy our social program. Well, it may not say that in the agreement, but that's what it's going. No. He said, no, look, I offered to answer any question about what's in this agreement. If you don't have a question about what's in this agreement, then this discussion is over. And he got up and left. So he got out of it. But it was a remarkable campaign. I had a football, this is a true story too, I had a football coach come to my back door in the Glebe in Ottawa, pounding on the door saying, what is wrong with you guys? Don't you have any confidence in Canadians? We can compete against Americans. Here's a TV ad. This is the kind of ad you guys should be running, instead of those flabby ads you've been running on TV during the campaign. So I fed it into Party Central, and you know, the campaign ads did pick up during the balance of the campaign. But you're absolutely right. They were not expecting it to be as controversial as it became. I think the business community was caught flat-footed. I think they rallied as well. I think it was a massive advertising campaign by the business community that certainly helped in Ontario. But you're right, and I can only tell you that I think it's a fair comment that they were caught off guard. They did, however, I can remember their pollster was Ellen Gray, and he said, we have to bomb the bridges of John Turner. He has no credibility on this issue. Everybody knows he supports free trade. He's doing this strictly for his own reasons. So the tactic that was defined was, okay, Mike Wilson, the most credible member of our cabinet, has to stand up somewhere and say that John Turner is lying. That was a campaign tactic.
You win.
I'd like to just hear a little more about treason. In the initial presentation, there was reference to treason, and I'd like to hear a little more about what that was.
Laurier felt betrayed. Betrayed by people who had supported him in the past, people on whom he had relied in the past. Clifford Sifton in particular was the devil in the story. Laurier had brought him into cabinet, had given him the position of Minister of the Interior. Sifton broke with Laurier in 1905, but stayed in the party and campaigned actively against him, rallied with the Toronto 18, the group of businessmen, mostly former Liberals, who simply could not support Laurier and who, again, actively campaigned against him. Laurier felt betrayed. In Quebec, doubly betrayed. The idea that a former Liberal like Henri Bourassa would openly accuse Laurier of lying, of actively working against the interests of Quebecers, accusing him of the worst sins possible, accusing Laurier of betraying the people of Quebec, of betraying the promise that he had given Quebecers in the past. There was a lot of that kind of drama, and I think that this certainly, Laurier caught in all this. I mean, it lashes out. His rhetoric as August and September move on becomes all the more assertive, very resentful of the fact that many people who had supported him in the past no longer did. He said, I didn't change. Many times he said this, I didn't change. I have been supporting the idea of reciprocity with the Americans since my first days in politics. I haven't changed. We have an opportunity now to negotiate. We have a negotiated agreement with the Americans. I haven't changed. Others have changed. They have betrayed my vision. They have betrayed me. It adds to the drama of that campaign.
Okay, I've got three other questions. We're going to get through all of them. I'm going to ask everybody to be brief in the question and brief in the answer, please. So let's start with Delroy.
Yeah, so here's my question. It was mentioned that the 1911, the creation of the Navy was a huge, sticking point, particularly in Quebec's drive away, aversion to perceived imperialism of the British. And yes, everyone, like, how does that compare to the recent return to the original roots as being the Royal Canadian Navy, and how it's seen now as a, I guess, is it seen the same way, like a lot of people think of it as being a return to our old nannies, say, having a mother Britain once again on our backs?
Jack, briefly?
I found the return of the royal designation to be simply bizarre. It made no sense at all. Nobody except 3 people were calling for it, literally almost 3. They had 6,000 names on a petition, which is 0 in real numbers. And for some reason, the government decided it would do this. Makes no sense. I don't know to whom they're appealing. It certainly doesn't have any appeal in Quebec. It has no appeal in anybody who's born later than about 1960. It's just craziness. On the other hand, the monarchy is so unimportant in Canada that it doesn't have any negative effect. So it's probably something they can get away with.
Great, thanks, Curtis. I was struck by your last comment, Professor Granstein, about moving back, perhaps the first time in 100 years, to a 2-party system. Also struck by the fact that you mentioned the series of events that was caused after the 1911 election that led to a 3-party system. Mindful also that in 1988, once the free trade agreement was over, we moved from a 3 to a 5-party system. Wondering in that context about the extent to which the debate moved from between the parties to the skillful managing of coalitions within the parties, and whether or not there's any parallels between today and then.
It's a good question, but I think our parties have always been coalitions. They have always been regional coalitions, religious coalitions, industrial coalitions. And a skillful prime minister was someone like Laurier who could manage his coalition. It fell apart in the end in 1911 and 1917 even more so. But he had been quite magical in the way he did it. And Borden wasn't good at it necessarily, but Mackenzie King, who came after Borden, was very good at it. And his successors, the ones who governed for a long time, were very good at it. So the key, I think, is that when parties fall apart, it's because the coalition management within the party breaks down. And I think that's what happened. And then a skillful manager comes back. Harper very skillfully reunited the coalitions within the Conservative Party. Someone now presumably will come along and try to do the same thing for the Liberals and the NDP. They once, in effect, used to be together 100 years ago.
And the last question to William Johnson.
My mother was French, my father was Irish. Both were anti-monarchists. My son, I called him Macdonald-Laurier. The point I'm making is this. In 1911, as in the elections of '87, there were very powerful antagonisms between the dominant imperialism that was sweeping the country, as in the '87 election and 2011, and Quebec's sense of identity as being Catholic and isolationist. Now those have diminished, and you said a moment ago that the monarchy has become so irrelevant. But I would put as a question, but maybe really as a point, an argument, that in fact Quebec will never really feel that we have accepted this country in itself as an independent country, as long as our head of state is the queen of another country.
I agree entirely.
Could I add a footnote, William, and that is, I feel a bit the same as Jack about the decision to hang the portrait of the Queen in all our embassies around the world, which is equally bizarre. I can remember, when I served in Tokyo, I went to an exhibition of British products at a department store in Tokyo, and I said to a fellow from the British embassy, I said, I don't see any products from Canada here, so I guess when the Queen travels, she's the Queen of Britain, not the Queen of Canada. And he said, I don't suppose we ever thought of that. Indeed.
Okay, very briefly. please.
I'd like to address the last question on the monarchy. First, I think I should introduce myself. My name's Alan Jones. I'm the chairman of the local branch of the Monarchist League. And I'd like to inform Mr. Granatstein of some of the background information that I acquired.
No, there's going to be a question.
Okay. You're wrong, sir. There were thousands of people supporting the change, I can assure you. Not just 3.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, malheureusement, l'heure est venue de mettre un terme à cette conférence très intéressante. This concludes the formal part of our evening. Please join me in thanking the 3 members of our panel this evening, Dr. Cecile, Derek Burney, Jack Granatstein.